Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on effective teacher policies, insights from PISA. The webinar is based on the OECD report that was published today and which is available on the OECD iLibrary page. Andreas Schleicher, OECD Director for Education and Skills, is joining us today to present the findings from this report. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson. The PowerPoint is available as a handout. You just click on the handout sign at the top of your screen to download the results. Now to you, Andreas. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is a very, I hope this works now. This is a very special report that we are launching today. And it is special not only because it talks about teachers who we know are always being the most important resource in education, but it's special because it's the first time that we've been able to draw together the results from PISA, where we talk about student learning outcomes, with information on teachers. Those of you who know us since a long time know we have collecting a lot of data through PISA about student learning and the learning outcomes. Then through our TALIS survey, we have been collecting a lot of data about teachers and their practices. And now, for the first time, we bring those two perspectives together to answer a range of important questions. And why is it worthwhile to look at this across countries? Because the results from PISA show us that there are huge differences across countries, both in the quality of education. You can see that here represented on the vertical axis. The higher countries are up, the better the outcomes, but also with regard to equity. The dependency on learning outcomes on the social context of students in schools, which you can see here on the horizontal axis. The more you are to the right, the more equitable learning opportunities are. So huge differences across countries suggest it's worth looking at this across countries. We've basically tried to look at three questions. First of all, is there something special among the best performing education systems and how they recruit, develop, and retain effective teachers, how they pay them, and then also how does the way in which we allocate teachers to schools affect the equity in education systems? To what extent are we successful in attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and so on? And also, how can countries attract and make teaching not just financially, but also intellectually attractive for the next generation of teachers? We asked this by looking at today's 15-year-olds in their own aspirations.
Andreas, excuse me, it's Eric. We don't see the PowerPoint.
You cannot often discern cause and effect in the relationships that you can see, and so I'm not going to try that in this report. And let me talk about the main findings of the report. First question, are there qualities that are unique to teacher policies and high-performing education systems? We looked at systems that do really well overall. We looked at systems that have seen particularly important improvements over the last decade. And we looked at schools that, once we take into account their social context, to what extent that have been particularly successful.
Andreas,
so the first thing people often say is that, in order to develop, effective teachers, you need to give schools a lot of discretion on how they select the teachers. But actually, if you look at high-performing education systems here, you can see there are some in which schools have considerable discretion over hiring teachers and sometimes over firing. You look at the left side, Slovenia, Macau, Estonia, New Zealand, and so on. But there are also high-performing education systems like Korea, like Japan, like China, Singapore, where actually the relative involvement of schools in choosing their staff is quite limited. So this is not something where we can see any kind of speciality of high-performing school systems. Here you can see something where there is more of a consistent pattern. On the horizontal axis, you see the percentage of students in schools where school principals told us that professional development workshops are offered at their school. So there is a culture of professional development in the school. And you can see very clearly among the top performing countries, those are included in the red box, this is all very common. A little less so in Finland, but in most of the other high-performing education systems, there's a very strong culture in schools to invest in their teachers. So we have found at least one aspect where those systems actually have commonalities. And actually, when you look at this in more detail, as you find in the report, school systems that do well also typically have a mandatory and extended period of clinical education. What I mean by this is that basically the involvement of teachers into the reality of school life starts very early in their education. They spend a significant part of their learning, their initial teacher training in schools as a learning environment, sort of kind of work-based learning environment. There's often also highly tailored opportunities for in-service teachers, professional development. Again, workshops that look at things that are very special for the school, and that's sort of common. And those countries also tend to have teacher appraisal mechanisms that focus on the So again, I want to just highlight briefly, we say that high-performing education systems typically give the teachers a lot of clinical practice, work-based school education as part of their initial training. Teachers spend a lot of time in schools. They have highly tailored opportunities for professional development that look at specific issues. And also, there are usually teacher evaluation mechanisms in place that have a strong focus on continuous improvement. So less of a kind of mindset of accountability, more of a focus on improvement in the schools. We also see common features of countries that see improvement is that basically one thing that we thought, if there is decline in class size, you can see many countries on the left part of the screen, on the green side here, basically that's been a quite common trend over the last decade, making classes smaller. But honestly, we cannot see that related to improvements in learning outcomes. That's the vertical axis. But interestingly, the countries where schools have been given more responsibility, relatively speaking, for selecting teachers for hire, those also seem to be countries, as a trend, that have seen improvements in science performance. It's not so many countries here, and the relationship is not that clear, but it seems that greater responsibility in schools seems to be some of the covariates of better improvements. We ask in our PISA assessment the 15-year-olds what they like to do in their lives, and you could sort of basically just write down any kind of jobs who you would aspire to. And what we looked at, of course, is who of the 15-year-olds want to become a teacher. On the horizontal axis, you see a measure of how attractive 15-year-olds find teaching relative to other high-level professions. On the green part of the screen, you can see countries where teaching was, relatively speaking, more attractive to 15-year-olds than other professions. In the red part, teaching was not such a attractive career choice, at least sort of in terms of the relative mathematics performance. So in the green part, you can see students that do relatively better if they wanted to become teachers. In the red part, you can see students who did relatively less well in mathematics when they choose to become teachers. So overall, you can see among the best performing students, teaching is in most countries not a very kind of prevalent choice, but there are some exceptions. And what you can see here clearly is that those exceptions tend to be among countries that do really well. In other words, long story short, teaching is a relatively attractive profession for talented 15-year-olds in high-performing education systems, less so in other education systems. Summarizing this, student achievement seems to be positively related to mean experience among teachers, negatively related to teacher turnover. When you look at student behavior and also the climate, the learning climate in schools, they seem to be positively related to, again, experience among teachers, also the share of teachers who are fully certified for their jobs, and the support that teachers experience from their principals. Let's move on to the next set of findings, where we looked at the extent to which teachers are matched to the kind of places where they can sort of leverage their experience best. To what extent are education systems successful in matching teacher resources with needs? First of all, I want to come back to the PISA results. Here I show you the learning outcomes by decile of social background. In the red dot, you can see the 10% most disadvantaged students in the United States and their performance. And the green dot symbolizes the performance in math of the 10% most privileged American 15-year-olds. You can see there's a big gap in the learning outcomes by the social background of their student. You might look at this chart and think, poverty is destiny. But if you look at students from a similar poor social background in Singapore, they can compare with the average American child. And if you look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in the province of Shanghai in China, you can see they do roughly as well as the students from the 10% most privileged Americans. So there's clearly something that education systems can do to leverage the talent of disadvantaged students. And behind that, of course, is the question, to what extent can we ensure that every student benefits from excellent teaching and attract talented teachers into challenging classrooms? And this is not just about the United States and Singapore and Shanghai. We can do this for every country. We can mark in red the most disadvantaged students in the learning outcomes, in the green triangle the kind of learning outcomes of the most privileged students, and do that across countries. And once you look at this, you can clearly see how widely the performance of similar students varies across countries. Where you go to school basically has a very significant impact on the quality of your learning outcomes, irrespective of the social background. Estonia, Vietnam are examples of countries where the 10% most disadvantaged students are still sort of quite favorably comparing to the average student in the OECD area. That holds at least for those who go to school. So again, poverty is not destiny. There's a lot that education can do to leverage the talent of disadvantaged students. And the question in the report now was, to what extent has this to do with teacher allocation, teacher sorting? Do schools with high concentrations of disadvantaged students have more and also better qualified teachers? Are differences in teacher resources between advantaged and disadvantaged schools related to socioeconomic achievement gaps among students? And then, are teacher resource gaps larger or smaller in systems that are more centralized versus those with greater school autonomy? Let me look at those questions one by one. The first thing that you can see here, and that might be surprising at first glance, is that in most countries, actually, classes are smaller in the most disadvantaged kind of schools. Marked here by the bottom quarter, this is the quarter of the most disadvantaged schools, and you can see here there are typically 24 students in a class, whereas in the top quarter, in the schools in the wealthiest neighborhoods, there seem to be almost 28 students in a classroom. So on the surface, it looks as we are giving more resources to more disadvantaged schools, which might be equity enhancing. But, if you actually look at qualifications of teachers, you can see the opposite pattern. You can see basically teachers without a university major in science, teaching in science. You can see that's a lot more common in the most disadvantaged schools than in the most privileged schools. So in the chart before, you saw that we are giving more, as a tendency across countries, giving more teachers to disadvantaged schools. But here you can see clearly that those teachers in the most disadvantaged schools tend to be less specialized, less qualified. So with regard to quality, we are actually having policies that seem to reinforce social disparities. And there's some other dimensions as well. For example, we see that in the bottom quarter of schools, by social disadvantage, teacher experience is often lower than in wealthier schools. So you see teachers with fewer teachers with specialization, and also fewer teachers with considerable career experience. And last but not least, when we ask principals about the extent to which a lack of teachers hinders learning in their school, you could see that that was much more prevalent in disadvantaged schools here on the left than it was among the most privileged schools. So if you just count, numbers, it seems that education systems have become quite good in aligning resources with needs. But as soon as you include aspects of quality, you can see that the reverse is true, that basically often the way we assign teachers to schools is reinforcing social disparities. The kind of incentive and support mechanisms that countries have in place do not seem very effective in aligning the quality of resources with the needs of schools. If you sum that up, basically, you can see that smaller classes is in more disadvantaged schools. That's very common. There are only a few exceptions where you could see, well, class size is penalizing most disadvantaged students. Now, you basically talk 3 versus 38 countries. When you, however, look at the quality of the issue, you can see really is that the teacher quality seems to be lower in the most disadvantaged schools in the vast majority of countries, and only a couple of countries where you could make an argument that teacher quality, at least in terms of formal certifications, is better in disadvantaged schools. Now, here you have 3 versus 23 countries. So in a way, we're doing well in quantity. We can do better in the quality of resources when we want to enhance equity. The question, of course, is, what actually matters most, quantity or quality? Well, the first thing that we can see is actually that socioeconomic gaps in student learning outcomes seem unrelated to differences in the size of classes between advantaged and disadvantaged schools. You can see here, sort of on the right side, classes that are basically quite favorable, where the average difference between advantaged and disadvantaged schools is sort of favorable. And on the left side, the few countries where class sizes seem to be larger in disadvantaged schools. But overall, that does not relate to the vertical axis, the basically socioeconomic achievement gaps between students in schools. But what you can see quite clearly is that social achievement gaps are larger in countries where teacher qualifications and experience are inequitably distributed. And remember, the first chart was about quantity. We don't see a relationship. As soon as we talk about quality, here measured in kind of teacher qualifications, you can really see that becomes a predictor of equity in learning outcomes. So the aspects and the areas where we are not doing so well across countries, namely the teacher quality allocation, that's the one that seems to count when we look at learning outcomes in schools. Last but not least, this is also quite sort of puzzling finding at first. Some might say, well, if we give schools more discretion, more room to hire and fire teachers, then, high-performing schools might be very good to attract great teachers, and low-performing schools might suffer from that. So in a way, you could argue that more autonomy with schools could actually exasperate inequalities in outcomes. But if you look at this chart, that's not what we see. In fact, where school responsibility for hiring and also firing teachers and also for setting salaries is greater, where schools have more of a role in human resource management, we can actually see that those kind of systems seem to be better in matching resources with needs. That is, to attract more talented teachers into a socioeconomically more disadvantaged environment. Great examples are Hong Kong and Macau. They are very much on the right side. There are systems where actually schools are the main driver of almost any decision, and yet they seem to be quite good in matching resources with needs. They seem to be able to get the most qualified teachers into the most disadvantaged schools. So, what underlies that relationship is probably quite difficult to discern. Probably, you could certainly not conclude making schools more autonomous is going to raise equity in the education system. But what you could probably conclude is that education systems that give schools a lot of responsibilities also tend to have mechanisms in place that align resources with needs. Right? Autonomy and equity don't seem to be mutually exclusive. When you actually look at the kind of policies that we observe across countries, there are several dimensions. Some countries invest a lot in managing and consolidating their school networks. Even schools, some systems that have a very high share of independent schools or private schools and so on, they still create very strong public school systems where they're well connected, those schools, work under similar kind of inspection regimes, supervision regimes, and so on. We do have countries that deploy formula-based approaches to school financing, sort of setting financial incentives that link resources with kind of student needs that can go to households and to schools. School systems that have parental choice often apply admission policies like controlled school choice that seem to moderate the impact, of selection. Some education systems have done a lot to, pair high and low performing schools so that lower performing schools can benefit from the expertise of better performing schools. And of course, engaging parents and stakeholders is a very important policy lever. So lots of things going on. I wanted to sort of draw a little bit of your attention also to the last part of the report. Who of those 15-year-olds that we surveyed in PISA actually wants a career in teaching? Let's have a look at this. The question that we basically ask is, what kind of job do you expect to have when you're about 30 years old? Students could just write in whatever they like. And you can ask yourself, to what extent do 15-year-olds have realistic expectations about their future? Difficult to say. No? And also we have about 1 in 10 students who basically didn't respond to the question. So they didn't know or they didn't want to respond to this. So there's some uncertainty associated with this. But here are the results. Basically, 50% of students across OECD countries want to work as professionals, and that includes teachers. And basically 4% of students expect to work as teachers. And that is sort of roughly congruent with the actual percentage who go into teaching. So it's quite consistent. There are more girls than boys among these students, and that again tends to be reflected in teacher demographics. Immigrant students are less likely to aspire to become teachers, and we see a sort of slight dependency on parental education. So students whose parents have completed school or tertiary education seem to be more likely to be aspiring to become teachers. So that's the overall picture, but of course it varies a lot across countries. And there is some other important variation that we came across. The first question, of course, is, what about the performance of those students? And what we see is then when you compare the students who aspire to become teachers versus those who aspire to become other forms of professionals, generally in mathematics and also reading, those students aspiring to become teachers perform somewhat lower than those who aspire to become other professionals. So it seems that teaching is less of an expectation among students with better learning outcomes, which is sort of a pity because, you'd want to attract the brightest students into the teaching profession. But, as a kind of moderator of this, we have looked into this actually much more carefully with our PIAC survey, where we looked at, where we tested the skills of workers directly. And what you can see here in blue is the middle half, the test scores of the middle half of university graduates across countries, college graduates. And you can see, in Japan and Finland and Belgium, Germany, Norway, Netherlands, Austria, Czech Republic, there you can basically see college graduates tend to be quite highly skilled, less so in Spain, less so in Poland, and so on. But the question is, how do teachers fit into this picture? Let me show you. This is a red part. So you can see countries like Japan and Finland, college graduates are highly skilled, and teachers are even skilled better than the average college graduate. So here you can see sort of a very high kind of professional level of education in the kind of workforce, and even better skills among teachers. Teaching seems to be one of the most attractive choice for highly skilled workers. You look at Norway. Overall, you can say the graduate distribution is quite similar to Japan and Finland, but in Norway, teachers tend to be drawn more from the lower end of the graduate distribution. So teaching doesn't seem to be as attractive. Look at Poland. There you can see basically the graduate distribution is not so strong, and it's quite challenging to attract talented people or skilled people into the teaching profession. So there are some differences here, but in the vast majority of countries, teachers come pretty much from the average. Teachers are very similar to the average graduates. So those people who say, the best people become teachers or the worst graduates become teachers, that's generally not true. Teachers tend to be very typical college graduates. And that's why I would not read too much into the aspirations of 15-year-olds. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, the overall share of those 15-year-olds who want to become teachers is positively related to teacher salaries. So countries that pay their teachers really well seem to be offering something that 15-year-olds somehow feel. The teaching status of the teaching profession seems to be high. We also see that the share of boys who want to become teachers is positively related to teacher salaries, in particular. But, and that's a great but, the performance of students who aspire to become teachers is not related to teacher salaries. So in one way, you could say increases in teacher salaries are good. They basically raise the aspiration of the profession. You could see that salaries alone are not going to be enough to attract the kind of best performing students into the teaching profession. It's not just about making teaching financially more attractive, but also making teaching intellectually more attractive. What do I conclude from this? First of all, improving the effectiveness, efficiency, and also equity of schooling depends to a large extent on ensuring that good people want to work as teachers, that their teaching is of high quality, and that the high quality teaching is provided to all students, in particular to the most disadvantaged students. And you could see from the data, in quantity, we're trying to achieve that. In quality, most education systems can do a lot better in attracting talented teachers to challenging classrooms. 4 points very briefly. High-performing education systems don't enjoy sort of natural privilege. No? You could argue, well, there's a traditional respect for teachers. We couldn't really see that relationship. What you can see very clearly is that they have built a high-quality teaching force through making very deliberate policy choices. We also see that greater autonomy of schools is not related to greater disparities in student performance, and particularly not to greater inequities in teacher allocation. In fact, the reverse is what you could see. Those education systems that put a lot of responsibility at the front line tend to be better in allocating qualified teachers to disadvantaged schools. So overall, countries need to really watch not just the quantity of resources they allocate by the different types of schools, but very much also the quality of teaching resources. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and I have with me also Francesco Affisati, who is actually the mastermind and principal author of this report. He's with me at this webinar as well.
So Andreas, we have a few questions. The first one is, why did you publish this report now?
Well, we've just completed those analyses. They were more complex because what it involved was actually relating the data from PISA. So the data that we collected from teachers is part of a special teacher questionnaire. So it just took us more time to basically examine those data. There's no particular, timing involved here.
Thank you. There's another question about the experience of teachers. How can countries ensure that experienced teachers both stay in the profession and also want to teach in disadvantaged schools?
This is one of the most challenging kind of questions you could ask about this report. First of all, it has to do, with attractive careers, and that involves money. But it's not just about money. So we have some high-performing or some countries where teachers are really well paid, where teaching is not generally seen as being an attractive career choice. So what is at stake here is also to make teaching really, intrinsically, intellectually attractive through, for example, differentiated career profiles. Allowing teachers to develop in different directions. If you're a teacher, in Singapore, the first day you enter your school, the education system asks you, what do you want to do in your life? You want to go into, pedagogy, you want to go into assessment policies, you want to go into leadership. So teachers have a lot of choices how they can evolve in their career, and that seems to be something that is related to the attractiveness of the profession. You go to a country like Finland, also there you get about 9 applicants for every teaching post. It's harder to get into teacher school than to get into, into law school or medical school. Why? Because it's such an interesting job. You spend a lot of time working with your colleagues. You have a high degree of professional autonomy, a strong collaborative culture. So those aspects are really important to retain people in the profession and to help them to stay. Basically, do we give teachers really good opportunities to advance their careers, to engage in professional development, to gain new insights? Those things really matter. In some of the countries, for example, you look at the United States or to some extent England, teachers have actually relatively little time to do other things than teaching. It's a relatively high teaching load. That's often the price for relatively small classes. Countries can't spend the money on everything at the same time, so they give their teachers relatively small classes to teach, but that means that teachers often have less time for other things than teaching. You go to the other end of the world, a country like China, where teachers teach often less than half the hours an American or British teacher would teach, but they would spend a lot more time working individually with students. They would spend a lot more time observing other teachers' classes. They would spend a lot more time working with parents. So, and those kinds of factors, the way we organize the work, we offer teachers interesting careers, actually I would give at least as much importance than simply the monetary aspects of basically teacher pay and teacher careers.
We have another question. Did you compare the qualifications of teaching staff in the USA versus that of the world, specifically China, India, and Singapore?
Actually, I should qualify this. Basically, what we look at here is whether teachers are certified for their job in their country. So I can't actually say that, the qualification in absolute terms of teachers in one country is better than in another. These are basically just it's the share of teachers who have been certified to teach in their subject.
We have one more question here. You mentioned that more hiring freedom can reduce teacher shortages in disadvantaged areas. But how can we make sure that the schools with wealthier parents and more resources will not end up attracting the best teachers, thereby reinforcing inequalities?
Yeah, that's exactly the hypothesis that we had as well, quite frankly. We expected actually to see the relationship in, let me just see whether I can find that chart. We expected that to go in the opposite direction, that actually we find that school systems that offer more discretion to schools to hire and fire teachers and build careers, that those schools would end up, those systems would end up to be more inequitable. That's what we expected. Why didn't we find it? I can only offer hypotheses. And one of those hypotheses is that schools that build a lot of responsibility at the front line, that gives their schools a lot of discretion, in general, are also school systems that basically build strong overall school systems. I'll give you an example. When you look, for example, to the Netherlands in Europe, and where schools, or Estonia, where schools basically are the main driver of public policy, at the very same time, you have a very strong system that watches quality overall. There's a strong inspection culture, there is a strong improvement culture, there's a good kind of teacher appraisal system. So the education system has many levers to ensure that the schools with the greatest needs also have the means to hire very, very good teachers. But at the end of the day, the schools seem to be capable of doing that too. So in a way, these findings were surprising for us, but they are encouraging in the sense that school autonomy does not need to stand in the way of greater equity. Even inversely, you could argue in education systems that are sort of highly mechanized, where the teacher kind of allocation is very kind of scripted and formula based, that there it may actually become harder to align resources with needs. But I also welcome, my colleague Francesco, if he has any insights on this, to offer them here.
Thank you, Andreas. I may actually add a few points here. The first is we actually saw probably two types of countries which are very different, which get it right, which manage to at least balance teacher experience, teacher qualifications, and across the share of, for instance, newly novice teachers across schools that are disadvantaged and advantaged. And one group of countries includes Korea, Japan, which are very centralized systems in some ways, where it's not school autonomy that is driving this, but it's the fact that there are schemes for mobility of teachers which explicitly try to keep into account the need to balance experience across schools, and so somewhat reducing probably some freedom of teachers. Mobility is not just voluntary. There is a mandatory element to mobility, and especially they manage to put incentives. Sometimes it's monetary incentives, very often it's career incentives, whereby teachers are actually willing to go to teach in the most challenging schools because that gives them a career progression and by taking up this challenge. But by and large, the schools that have the school systems that have a limited autonomy for hiring and selecting, firing teachers at the school level, they tend to have systems where teacher mobility is mostly voluntary, and it's very difficult in that scheme to avoid the effect whereby teachers who may not receive sufficient support, who may not receive sufficient compensation also for the more challenging circumstances in which they teach, do not choose to leave the most challenging schools to go and teach in more privileged schools. What we see in the systems where there is more school autonomy is not just that autonomy per se is driving this result, but to put in place the kind of measures that redress inequities seems to be much easier in systems with autonomy. And these kinds of measures are essentially allocating resources in a fair way between disadvantaged schools and advantaged schools, checking that the schools that have wealthier parents and more resources to start with do not end up with even more resources and better teachers at the end, balancing in some way, well, giving, for instance, more resources to higher experienced teachers to these schools, giving them more freedom to create positions for teachers which are attractive to the most experienced teachers, who may combine teaching with mentoring of other teachers, who may actually get specialized into teaching in those kind of circumstances. And so creating within schools some sort of careers, creating across the system incentives so that the actually most challenging schools, they have the best school leaders, they have the best resources to actually make positions that are attractive to the best teachers. That seems to be the case much more often than we perhaps may have thought. It's interesting, so a couple of examples we cite in the report. We cite Ireland, for instance. Ireland has a system where all schools are essentially autonomous. More than 50% are actually not non-state schools in Ireland, and yet the funding comes entirely from the government for those schools. And the government has put in place formulas for funding schools and explicitly programs for teacher training, teacher support that are offered that do give a great advantage to the most disadvantaged schools. So there's about 20% of the schools in Ireland which are identified as being more challenging and in need of extra support, and teachers who teach at those schools, they have priority access to a series of government initiatives for teacher professional development. These schools are able to reduce class size in primary grades through extra funds. They receive also extra teachers who are specialized into career orientation, for instance, later on, who are specialized into literacy support in the primary grades, so that they explicitly target additional funds to the most challenging schools. And this seems not just to be the case in Ireland, but in many other countries where there is freedom at the school level to hire and set the working conditions of teachers.
Andreas, would you like to add anything? If not, we can go to another question.
Yes, please.
What is it that high-performing countries such as Japan, Korea, Estonia, or Switzerland do right to make sure that teaching attracts talented students?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Particularly in Asia, teachers typically get considerable time for other things than teaching. There's a lot of investment in basically teacher professional development in those countries. In lessons study, teachers are involved in observing each other's practice, working on how to improve them. So the collaborative culture geared towards professional development is very strong. There's a lot of responsibility of teachers for working with students outside classroom settings, for working with their parents. The social responsibility, the relational aspect between students and teachers is very important in those systems. When it comes to equity, China is a good example where most career paths of teachers work through disadvantage. And that's true for teachers, it's true for principals. So if you're a vice principal in a high-performing school and you want to become principal, then the education system will tell you, well, first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So they're always trying to match resources, the expertise of teachers with the needs of schools. In Japan, typically teachers change their school every 3 to 5 years. So there is, if they want to have a career, so basically teacher mobility is linked with career advancement. So Singapore is also a very good example for a very strong kind of teacher career model, where teachers can evolve in multiple ways, where there is a good performance appraisal process in place, a lot of mentoring, coaching available. Teachers spend 100 hours per year in various kinds of activities around professional development. So the culture of professionalization and the culture of equity are quite deeply embedded in the East Asian countries. And you can see that both in the results of this study, but also very much so in the results from PISA, where the impact of social background on learning outcomes tends to be a lot smaller than it is in Europe or North America.
Andreas, there are a couple of questions about low-income countries. How do the results relate to low-income countries where teaching is even, for example, less attractive as a career option because teachers' salaries don't cover living costs even, for example?
Yeah, in low-income countries, the challenges are magnified. And overall, you can see, for example, that in low-income countries, simple spending on education makes a huge difference. There's a very strong and steep relationship between resources invested per student and learning outcomes, which is not so clearly visible in middle and high-income countries. So for low-income countries, there are very difficult choices. How do I trade off the pay for a teacher with the size of a class? And I think those kinds of choices are political choices in high-income countries and low-income countries. Those issues are really, really difficult. But ensuring that teacher pay is reasonably competitive, not with the average salary, but with the average salary of qualified workers, is obviously of paramount importance. Some certainty and stability, for example, in a high-income countries, attracting a great teacher in a disadvantaged school may not involve moving to a kind of very rural, remote environment where lots of kind of issues are at stake. In a low-income country, those issues are very, very kind of serious concerns. So overall, one can say is that the level of resources makes much more of a difference in a low-income country.
Thank you. We have one other question. What variables determine advantaged and disadvantaged schools?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah. Andreas, if you want, I think it's a clarification question. I can give that clarification. What we did is really in this exercise, when we talk about disadvantaged schools, we talk about schools that have about 1/4 of all the country's students and which have the lowest average socioeconomic status in the country. And when we talk about advantaged schools, we take the top quarter of schools, or the quarter with which represent 25% of students and whose average socioeconomic status, so as measured by parental education levels, occupation levels, and wealth, is among the highest in the country. So we are really using a simple measure to divide all the country schools into 4 categories. We take the 2 extreme categories to mean advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools throughout this report.
And we have another question. Do you know of a country that succeeded in significantly improving the attractiveness of the teaching profession?
Actually, this is a really good question. It's not answerable in this report, which is purely cross-sectional, but there are a couple of examples. I mean, in Europe, you could actually look at England, where teaching in the 70s used to be highly unattractive, and where the country was able to quickly improve the attractiveness of the teaching, mainly through changing career structures and also the financial, the pay scales. But we don't have really time series data to look at this systematically.
Okay, we're just having a look. There's lots of questions coming in, so we're just looking at one which would work well. Do you think this one? Can you see any correlation between a teacher's literacy and reading skills and their class's academic performance?
Yes, we can. In fact, the PIAC data that I showed you, where we tested actually the literacy and numeracy skills of teachers versus those of other professionals, and studies have shown that actually they do relate to academic outcomes. So tested skills of teachers are a good predictor for tested skills among students. There's actually a paper by Eric Hanushek from the Hoover Institute on this topic.
Thank you. Francesco has another question.
We have another question that we received from the audience. There's someone asking, professors in university teach less time, whereas in schools in K to 12, teachers spend basically all the time just teaching. Why is it so? And don't we today have technologies to help make the profession more diverse and make teaching a more probably interesting profession in that way?
Did you want to answer it, Francesco or Andreas?
Sorry, I thought this was a question for Francesco, but do
you want to answer it, Francesco?
So yeah, well, I don't have an answer from that report. So, but it is a great observation. I mean, I think one of the main takeaways from this report, when we look at the highest performing countries in PISA, is that actually teaching there is not just about standing in front of a classroom and teaching. It's the teachers there. What is really part of the job description for teachers is also being some kind of a researcher, but a researcher on one's own practice and on the practice, professional practice of colleagues. So lifelong learning, professional inquiry, these are really aspects that are emphasized in high-performing countries, and they're emphasized through various ways. So it starts really with initial teacher preparation. There's not just one recipe that every country applies. There's many ways in which this gets the attention of countries. But what's common really is that at the center of initial teacher preparation is improving the practice in front of the classroom and creating those habits of professional exchange and professional inquiry that will help the teacher keep at the front of its knowledge, at the front of pedagogical innovation throughout the career, the long career that he or she has in front of himself. The other thing is it keeps being emphasized during the induction period, the first steps in the profession, where they receive a lot of support from more experienced colleagues. And then later on, during regular teacher evaluation, teacher appraisals, which can be formal or informal, but most of these countries, even when they have some elements of high stakes evaluation systems, they always complement it and have either another system or a more frequent, in fact, form of teacher evaluation, which is more informal and which entirely is geared towards improvement, towards improving the practice, towards giving feedback, keeping teachers mobilized to improve student learning, and to address the challenges, the difficulties that they encounter in the classroom, and the challenges that the school has with its current student body. So this is, I think, this difference between teachers in K-12 and university teachers need not be there necessarily. I certainly think, as the reader, that technology can help also, but it's not just about technology. It's really about the mindset and the human relationship, the support you receive from colleagues, the exchange you have with colleagues. In these countries, teaching, it doesn't happen in isolation, and it doesn't happen in a black box where nobody looks into it. It is a very public profession where you receive lots of feedback and lots of suggestions for improvement from many sources. Data from technology, but also people, colleagues, principals, and so on.
Thank you. And thank you, Andreas, and to all the participants for your interest in this topic. If you would like to find out more, you can find the publication is available on the OECD iLibrary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.